The airport was bustling with activity as passengers hurried toward their gates, eager to board their flights. Among them was Major Daniel Franks, a tall, well-built man in his mid-30s, wearing his military uniform. His sharp uniform, adorned with the various honors and medals he had earned through years of dedicated service, made him stand out in the crowd. He walked confidently, but with a quiet humility, as he made his way to his seat in first class. The flight was bound for Washington, D.C., where he had just received an appointment to the prestigious position of Army Chief. As Daniel sat down, he noticed the polite but distant smiles of the flight attendants as they assisted him into his seat. He was no stranger to traveling, but this time was different. This time, he felt the weight of the new responsibility ahead of him, and with it came the unease of leaving behind the familiar life he had known in service for so many years. As he adjusted his seatbelt and settled in, he mentally prepared for the journey that lay ahead. Just as Daniel began to relax, a middle-aged woman named Karen walked into the first-class cabin, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She was dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and status. Her eyes scanned the cabin, and as she noticed Daniel seated by the window, her expression immediately soured. Karen's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. She leaned slightly to her side, positioning herself so that her voice would be carried throughout the cabin. "I don't understand how people like him can afford first-class tickets," she muttered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, her tone dripping with disdain. Her words, though seemingly subtle, were laced with judgment. Her eyes narrowed as she continued to size up Daniel. He was aware of the glance she gave him, the barely concealed contempt in her expression. While Karen's words were quiet, the tension in the cabin began to mount. Some passengers looked up, exchanging awkward glances, unsure of how to respond. Daniel remained still, keeping his eyes focused forward, attempting to ignore the growing discomfort around him. He had dealt with prejudice in various forms throughout his life, but hearing it so overtly, especially in a space like this, struck a nerve. Still, he knew it was better to rise above, to stay composed. He had learned through his years in the military that maintaining dignity in the face of adversity was one of the most powerful actions one could take. Yet, as Karen continued her whispered remarks, the tension in the air grew, and Daniel's patience was beginning to wear thin. The tension in the air was palpable as Karen, still fuming from her earlier judgment, stood up abruptly in the middle of the flight. The passengers around her looked on, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others eyeing the situation with growing concern. Karen's face was flushed with indignation as she turned toward the flight attendants, who were passing through the aisles, checking on passengers. With a sharp tone, Karen demanded, "Excuse me, I need to speak with you." "This man," she pointed to Daniel with an exaggerated gesture, "is sitting in the wrong seat. He doesn't belong here in first class. Please, check his ticket immediately." The flight attendant, a young woman with a calm demeanor, approached Karen with a smile. "Ma'am, I assure you, I've checked his ticket. He is seated in his assigned seat. Everything is in order." Karen's face twisted in disbelief, her voice rising. "That's impossible. How could someone like him possibly afford a first-class ticket? What is going on here?" Her words were sharp and dripping with disdain, her prejudice seeping through her every syllable. Other passengers, now more visibly uncomfortable, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others avoided eye contact, unsure of how to handle the confrontation. Despite the escalating tension, Daniel remained seated, his posture straight, his face calm and unreadable. The flight attendant, Still polite, but now visibly concerned, said, "Ma'am, there's no need for this. He's not causing any trouble. Please, take your seat." But Karen was having none of it. She crossed her arms, glaring at Daniel as she continued her tirade. "You see," she began, her voice growing louder, "I've worked hard for everything I have. People like you don't belong here. You don't fit in. First class is for people who deserve it, who've worked for it. You—" She paused, her words stinging with contempt. "You don't belong here." The passengers around her fell silent. Some looked at Daniel, unsure of what to do, while others, realizing the absurdity of the situation, began to shift uneasily in their seats. But Daniel, unfazed, met her gaze with an expression of quiet dignity. The off-duty officer, now sitting upright and slightly adjusting his uniform, addressed the rest of the cabin with respect. "This man is the Army Chief. He's a decorated officer and the epitome of what our military stands for. He's here for his official swearing-in ceremony in Washington." The revelation caused a ripple of surprise through the cabin. Passengers who had been sitting passively, unsure of how to react, now looked at Daniel with renewed respect. Some even whispered to each other, their expressions full of awe and admiration. Karen's face, which had been flushed with anger moments before, drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She was now trapped in the web of her own prejudices. The uncomfortable truth settled in. The man she had berated and dismissed was not only deserving of respect, but held an esteemed position in society, a position she had unjustly belittled without a second thought. The whispers among the passengers grew louder. One woman, sitting a few rows ahead of Daniel, muttered to her neighbor, "I can't believe she said that. How could anyone treat someone like that?" The young man beside Daniel, who had earlier been silently observing the scene, leaned forward, offering Daniel a quiet apology. "I didn't know, sir. I'm so sorry for her behavior." Daniel nodded graciously, his composure never faltering. "It's okay. It's not about me. It's about all of us. We need to be better." The atmosphere in the cabin had entirely shifted. Gone was the tension, replaced now with a sense of humility and regret from some, and a deeper respect for Daniel from the rest. The incident had not just been a matter of a rude confrontation, but had exposed something much deeper. Karen's actions were a stark reminder of how prejudice can blind people to the humanity and worth of others. Karen, now fully aware of her grave mistake, remained silent. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and she stared straight ahead, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Karen, realizing the gravity of her mistake, shifted in her seat and nervously cleared her throat. "I didn't know," she stammered, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. "I just assumed you were another one of those people who don't belong in first class." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her lap, avoiding eye contact with anyone around her. Daniel, still seated with a serene and dignified composure, addressed her calmly. "Respect isn't earned by rank. It's given to everyone equally," he said, his voice steady and firm. "Maybe it's time you learned that." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Karen, now utterly humiliated, opened her mouth but quickly closed it, unable to offer any further defense. She had no response, no way to explain away her actions. Her words, which had been filled with arrogance moments before, now felt empty. The tension in the cabin, which had been thick with awkwardness just moments earlier, suddenly broke. Several passengers who had been quietly observing the scene began to applaud. The applause started timidly at first, but it quickly grew into a full, appreciative show of support for Daniel. Some clapped slowly, Others raised their hands in sincere admiration for the grace and calm he had shown in the face of such disrespect. Karen's face turned crimson, a mixture of frustration and embarrassment flashing across her features. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to shrink into herself, but it was clear the moment had passed for her to redeem herself. The applause continued for a few moments more, drowning out any words she might have wanted to say. Daniel, unaffected by the attention he was receiving, simply nodded and said, "Thank you." He didn't seek out validation, only trying to do what he believed was right. He returned to his book, once again allowing the peace of the cabin to settle around him. Karen, however, sat in stunned silence, her earlier arrogance replaced by the uncomfortable weight of her own ignorance. The applause and the truth of her actions had exposed her in front of everyone on the plane, and there was no escaping it. The power of kindness, dignity, and humility had triumphed over the venom of prejudice. As the plane touched down at Washington, D.C.'s airport, the once tense atmosphere in the cabin began to dissipate. Passengers slowly gathered their belongings, quietly exchanging glances and still processing the confrontation they had witnessed. Daniel remained seated, calmly waiting for the seatbelt sign to be turned off. He knew his moment had passed, but his dignity was intact. As the doors opened, a military escort stood at the gate. A sleek, black car with official plates was parked nearby, and two armed officers stood at attention. The escort wasn't just for anyone. It was for Major General Daniel Franks, the new Army chief. His importance, once subtly hinted at during the flight, was now plainly evident as the high-ranking officials gathered to welcome him. Daniel stood up, retrieving his carry-on bag with ease and walking toward the aisle. He was met with a few quiet nods of respect from the flight attendants and some passengers who had silently acknowledged his presence. Daniel walked with purpose, not needing the loud declarations of authority that some might have craved. His reputation spoke for itself. Karen, still seated, watched the unfolding scene in stunned silence. She saw Daniel being greeted by officers in military uniform, a stark contrast to the disrespect she had shown him only hours before. Her mind raced, replaying her words and actions, realizing just how wrong she had been. The sound of the applause in the cabin echoed in her ears, a constant reminder of the shame she now carried. Her face flushed with regret. How could she have been so blind? She had assumed that a man like Daniel, someone who didn't look like her idea of authority, didn't belong in first class. She had let her biases cloud her judgment and had humiliated herself in front of an entire cabin of people. As she watched Daniel walk away with the military escort, she felt a deep sense of embarrassment. He had carried himself with such dignity, and she had failed to recognize that from the start. She thought about how she had looked at him with contempt, questioning his place in society based on nothing more than assumptions and prejudice. She hadn't bothered to see him as a person or as someone who had earned the right to be in that seat, just as she had. Daniel's figure grew smaller as he disappeared into the crowd, his uniform a symbol of his hard-earned respect. Karen remained behind, her head down, her shoulders slumped in shame. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Not only had she been wrong in her assumptions about him, but she had also displayed behavior that reinforced harmful stereotypes and prejudices. As Karen made her way off the plane, the reality of the situation weighed heavily on her. She would forever be remembered by the passengers on that flight as the woman who disrespected a hero, and no amount of justifying her actions could undo the damage she had done. The flight had ended, but her journey toward understanding and self-reflection had only just begun. As Daniel walked through the terminal, the weight of the moment finally started to settle in. His military escort moved quickly, guiding him toward the vehicle that would take him to the ceremony. But his mind wandered back to the flight. He had remained calm, just as he had been trained to do throughout his military career. He had handled Karen's insults with discipline and respect, choosing to respond with composure rather than anger. Yet, as he walked toward his destination, a part of him wished the situation had never occurred in the first place. Daniel had been a soldier for decades, having served his country in places where true honor and courage mattered far more than one's appearance or rank. He had seen prejudice in many forms, on battlefields, in boardrooms, and in civilian life. Yet every time it reared its ugly head, he couldn't help but wonder why so many people still base their perceptions of others on preconceived notions rather than on character and action. Why, in a world of progress, was it so difficult for some people to see others for who they truly were? As he boarded the car, the military escort flanking him, Daniel allowed his thoughts to drift further. What he had experienced on the plane was not just an isolated incident. It was indicative of a larger societal issue. People still judged others based on skin color, background, and even clothing, often overlooking the integrity and depth of a person's character. It was a bitter truth, but one that fueled his commitment to make change, to ensure that merit and respect, not assumptions, governed interactions in his world. Back in the terminal, Daniel was unaware that his restraint had sparked something in the passengers who had witnessed the exchange. Videos of the confrontation quickly spread through social media. They showed Karen's rude behavior and Daniel's unwavering dignity. The contrast was stark. An entitled woman who couldn't see past her biases versus a highly decorated soldier who had worked tirelessly for years to earn respect through his actions. The video became viral, with many commenting on how Daniel had handled the situation with grace, while Karen's shameful behavior drew sharp criticism. "Grace under fire," one user posted, praising Daniel for not retaliating with anger. A true hero both on and off the battlefield. Others shared similar sentiments, posting their respect for Daniel's calm demeanor. One user wrote, "I'm ashamed of how people like Karen behave, but proud to know there are people like Major Franks in this world. He's exactly the kind of man we need in leadership." The media picked up the story too, and soon Daniel's story made national headlines. His ability to remain composed in the face of disrespect and his gentle yet firm response to Karen's racism were celebrated across the country. What had begun as a small confrontation on a plane had turned into a moment of national reflection on prejudice and respect. Karen, on the other hand, became the subject of harsh critique. She attempted to explain herself in public interviews, but the public reaction was overwhelming. Her actions on the plane were seen as an example of unchecked privilege and ignorance. People took to social media to share their own stories of prejudice, showing solidarity with Daniel and condemning Karen for what many saw as an unwarranted attack on a man who had served his country. Daniel, however, wasn't interested in the growing media storm. He had never sought fame or recognition for his service, and he certainly didn't want his name to be used to shame another person. He reflected on the lesson he had learned through his years of service. No matter how difficult the world seemed, the best way to change it was by living your life with integrity. And that's what he had done that day. He had remained calm, composed, and respectful, even when confronted with ignorance. In the end, Daniel knew that real change wouldn't come from viral videos or public shaming, It would come from a collective effort to see one another for who we truly were, beyond appearances, beyond assumptions. That's the world he hoped to help build, one that judged people by their actions, not their assumptions. And while the viral video might have sparked a moment of awareness, he hoped it would inspire people to be better, not just in a single instance, but every day.